Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I was joined by three other guests who are also employed by AIBS. They're Steve Gallo, Joanne Sullivan, and Dejoy Croslin. I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment and also tell you a little bit about what they do at AIBS. But they were here to talk about their recently published article in Bioscience, and it's called Scientists from Minority-Serving Institutions and Their Participation in Grant Peer Review, which provides us a way to look at some of the inequities that are present in the way that science is funded. And we also talked a little bit about what kind of interventions might be best able to address those inequities. Anyway, it was a great conversation, and so with no further ado, let's go straight to the interview. All right, thank you all very much for joining me today.
Thanks,
Thank
James.
you, James.
Thank you, James.
Okay, if we could get started just so people can put names to voices, if each of you could just give a quick introduction of yourselves and what you do at AIBS.
Hi, I'm Steve Gallo. I'm the chief scientist at AIBS in the Scientific Peer Advisory and Review Services Division. And one of the things that I focus on in AIBS is the science of peer review, kind of looking at the process of peer review and how can we improve it and make it better and those kinds of things. So,
Hi, James. I'm Joanne Sullivan. I'm a program manager in the SPARS division at AIBS, and I've been with AIBS for almost 18 years. And I just do peer review. I've started off as a project associate and now worked my way up to program manager.
Hi, James. I am Dejoy Croslin, a senior scientist and program manager in the Scientific Peer Advisory and Review Services Department, as Steve said, at AIBS. I also help with our peer review services and have recently taken on the role of overseeing the diversity initiatives at AIBS and serve as the chair of the AIBS Board of Directors Diversity Committee.
Okay, great. And thanks again for being here. So I think just to get us started, I'm going to ask a question that is extremely unfair. And I tend to ask it every podcast, which is, could you please sum up, the last decades of your entire career by giving me a summary of the field that you work in? In this case, we're talking about grant review. And I'm just, hoping we could give our listeners just a little bit of an introduction to that general field, for those who are a little bit less familiar with the way that science gets funded.
I think maybe I'll take a stab at that if that's. So for most funding agencies, scientists who are conducting research will submit research proposals to that agency in response to a call for submissions. And those are with different mechanisms and different timelines and budgets, but there usually is some sort of call for people to submit proposals. And they collect them, and then they start a grant peer review process, which is a process whereby they invite scientists to participate in kind of a decision-making process, looking at these proposals that have been submitted and deciding which ones have the highest scientific merit. These often the groups of recruited scientists have very specific expertise relevant to the areas that of science that have been submitted. And they're trying to compare all these individual research proposals to kind of the gold standard of excellence. And they use several criteria using, things like research methodology and potential for impact and things like that. And often they review these proposals and then they meet somewhere, either virtually or on site, to kind of discuss these. And ultimately, the output of those review panels, is often kind of feedback that goes back to the applicant and to the science administrator to help them make funding decisions, as well as kind of a score. And the score kind of gives a sense of how, on a certain scale, what's the merit of that particular proposal. It should be noted, though, that agencies usually have these scientific administrators usually invite scientists to participate, and often there's a requirement for previous funding in order to be recruited on a panel. So an unspoken or spoken requirement. So anyway, then the outputs of these feedback go back to kind of the funding agency for them to make final decisions about which research they'd like to fund and which they would not. And yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell. I hope that covers everything.
Okay, I think that gives us a great overview. And I'm wondering now then, since we'll be talking today about the people who, serve on those panels and who perform that review, what's the relevance either to a scientific career or to the broader enterprise, of being one of those people who's, reviewing those proposals?
The importance of that is to be at the table to understand the process and to see on the back end as a scientist what happens when you actually review an application, what the peer review process is, and how this work that you do on the front end to write a grant, how that's received by those that make decisions about whether or not you are going to be funded. And so that to us is kind of the important part or the impetus for the work that we decided to start doing in the realm of the barriers to peer review.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's a case in which, if you're not at the table, you're not a participant in the process, it becomes a little harder to become the person who ultimately gets the funding and, is able to, have a successful scientific career.
Yeah,
I think that's our thought process. And I think Steve would probably agree. It's very akin to parents and children, right? Like you go into the room and you make a decision about what the children are going to do, and they might push back at you based on the decision that you've made. But when you make them a part of that decision and they understand why you made the decision and what the ultimate consequences are as a result, they're more akin to at least listening to what you have to say. And so I think it's very similar to that. If you don't know what goes on in the process for selecting funding, how can you put together a proposal that adheres to the criteria that is used to actually decide the funding? I probably said that in a very roundabout way, but no. Steve, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, if I could add something, I think, maybe one way to think about it is, as in part of a scientist career, funding is very important. It's important not only to fund the research that they're doing, but also for, career advancement and faculty appointments and all those kinds of things. Even impacts the amount of productivity you're able to create. So, but competition is extremely high all across science, and particularly at funding agencies like the NIH, where it's, I think a couple of years ago, they said that the average age of your first R01 grant is something like 42. So it's very tough competition, and often you have to submit several proposals before you actually get one funded. So there's high competition, and so people are looking also as a way to glimpse how to write a grant, but also what are reviewers looking for in grants. And so taking part in that process is also helpful from that perspective. But one of the issues that I think we're facing is that the patterns in funding are showing that the allocation of research funds to, for instance, white scientists versus black scientists is not equal. And so there's some suggestion that there's implicit bias that may be in the peer review process that be contributing to this. And so, and unfortunately, these differences in a lot of the reports that we've seen are not only significant, but also persistent. There was a report in 2011 highlighting this in Science by Donna Ginther, and 10 years later, she produced another study showing basically the same thing, and the difference between, for instance, black and white scientists had not changed at all. So after a decade of actively trying to do something about it, nothing really was effective. So if implicit bias is a contributor to this research funding discrepancy, then maybe a potential intervention is to improve diversity of review panels in order to kind of, like DeJoy said, if you have people from different perspectives on those panels, they may be more likely to understand where those scientists are coming from, why those topics are so important. And so that might be a potential pathway towards reducing this gap. But as I stated above, often previous success with grant funding is a requirement for review participation. So we've kind of set up a feedback loop. And if you look at NIH panel diversity right now, it's not very diverse. At least, for instance, I mean, there's very low levels of, for instance, African American scientists on review panels, at least based on data that's just recently been put out there by groups like the NIH. So, and in addition to this, not only does this happen kind of at the individual level, but also at the institutional level too. So if you look at traditional white institutions versus minority serving institutions, there's big gaps there in terms of funding levels. And in one study in 2014, there was a total of like 4 traditionally white institutes. The total funding from those 4 institutes was roughly similar to all of the historically Black colleges and universities, at least all the 4-year ones. So that's a pretty telling statistic, I think. So we don't really know much about representation of minority serving institution scientists from minority serving institutions and the representation on peer review panels. So that's something that I think we'd like to take a look at, and also, I mean, maybe you guys can chime in on this, but I think also these minority serving institutions are kind of islands of high levels of diversity, and they're important in the research ecosystem, and yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons why we're interested in that.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that in some kind of conversations that we've had internally at AIBS. We really look at specific in minority serving institutions, specifically the historically Black colleges and universities, and how large of a role HBCUs play in the STEM kind of pipeline. And I think we just have to reiterate that HBCUs represent, I think it's maybe like 3 to 4% of the nation's kind of population of higher education institutions. But as Steve mentioned, they have like relatively small endowments, lower resources, but have consistently over the last probably 20 years remained among the nation's top producers, it's probably the best way to say it, of African Americans who go on to have careers in STEM. And if I can remember correctly, I think a couple of weeks ago, I read an article, I think it was out 2010 or 2012, that said that HBCUs put out more than 1/3 of African American PhDs. If you start to think about how many of the African American PhDs today have trained or received an undergraduate degree at an HBCU. So that's a pretty big place. And then when you think about the HBCUs, the 20 or so HBCUs with PhD programs, they put out about 10 to 12% of African American PhDs. So this environment that HBCUs have with that, and they're considered minority serving institutions in which underrepresented minorities can come to and grow. What does that environment look like when we correlate that to the amount of funding that this environment can get to train underrepresented minority students to go out and be successful at a career in science? So I think it's just this loop of information that we keep kind of digging ourselves into that's very interesting, that starts at least with one type of survey and one set of research, which is what we started here.
Okay, so putting it all together, we know that funding is obviously very important, and we know that getting a seat at the table of the funding process by being a participant in grant review is also important. And we know that minority serving institutions themselves are very important and a source of the diversity that we're trying to find and build within science. So that kind of gives us a lens of looking at then the participation of scientists at minority serving institutions in the grant review process, and that kind of gives you a lens into understanding where these inequities might flow from. Do I have that basically right?
Yeah, I think so. To give it a little context, we had recently in the last couple of years created and conducted a survey of scientists, largely from traditionally white institutes, about their levels of participation in peer review and their motivations and all these kinds of things. And that was very interesting. One of the first works to do that, but our sample population was pretty limited. It was largely white, largely male, and mostly from traditionally white institutes. So one of our motivations was to get a sense of, well, there is data out there about, like, for instance, racial data about representation on NIH review panels. There's not a lot of information about levels of participation of, for instance, minority serving institutions, scientists from minority serving institutions. So that was one of our motivations, was to kind of, as a corollary to our previous work, to look and see, well, are the levels of participation from largely traditionally white institutions similar to those from minority serving institutions? Because there's clear large discrepancies in funding. And then the other is really to get a sense of, if there's not, or if there are differences, which we would suspect there are, we would like to get a sense of what the potential barriers are for those scientists to participate, and what their motivations are, and to contrast those against some of the data that we've collected from traditionally white institutes.
So then, how do you do it? How do you gather that data? What goes into making those sorts of analyses? How do you figure it out? Who's participating in which panels and from which institutes, et cetera?
Yeah. So we, well, what we did is we created a survey, which we based in part on our previous work. We did that on purpose so that we could keep some of the questions consistent between our previous survey and this one, so we could directly compare. And we then, and this is something that particularly me and Joanne worked on, is to identify lists of minority serving institutions, specifically historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and also Hispanic serving institutions. So we found some links related to that with lists, and then we basically went through those and made sure we identified four-year colleges that had likelihood of having actual, had the likelihood of their scientists submitting grant applications, so they'd be, invested in this process. And then we looked largely through those individual university websites to gather information about potential respondents. I don't know, Joanne, if you wanted to say anything about that in particular?
Yeah, so I just utilized the list that Steve gave me, and then I just kind of explored I opened up each university's website, and then kind of looked for anything that had to do with science. So anything ranging from psychology to biology to chemistry, any scientists that I could find, and I just added them to the survey. So I didn't really delve in. Sometimes I would delve into how, like, if I looked up their funding, but mainly I was just looking for just any scientists in general at that university. And then they were given the survey.
Right. Although we focused mostly on biology, right? I mean,
yeah. But I did include some chemistry, right, just because, some of our proposals do have a chemistry kind of base, but it was mostly biology. Yeah.
Okay, so you've gathered, this list of people. How many people are you then sending the survey to?
So we targeted, I think, 86 HBCUs, 21 tribal colleges, and 156 Hispanic serving institutions. And we extracted from those websites, what was it, Joanne, roughly 4,000?
I think it was around 4,000, give or take.
That's a lot of research. And then what kind of response rate did you get when you sent the survey out?
Yeah, well, it was a little lower than we would have liked. Survey research is hard, especially these days. The response rates are lower than we were hoping for, but they were high enough that we got a big enough sample, a couple hundred, to be useful and interesting to us. So there are some limitations to our study, but in that respect, but I think it's certainly a good spot, and it's a good start, and it's a good spotlight on where we could go from here.
And what kinds of things did you ask the survey respondents?
Right. So one of the big things that we wanted to know was the levels of participation. And so we asked those questions in a way that was identical to our previous research. That way we could kind of compare the questions or the answers. And we also looked at the motivations of people to participate in grant review, and as well as potential barriers that prevent people from participating. And in addition to all that, we also asked about grant submission. And part of the reason we asked about that was most people are not very interested in grant review if they're not actually submitting any grants. So we wanted to really make sure that our population were scientists who were actively submitting grants and were interested in that whole process.
Okay, great. And what kinds of things did you find? I pulled out the headline number for the press release, which was that you have only 45% of respondents from minority serving institutions who reported participating versus 76% of scientists from traditionally white institutions who'd participated in grant review. That seems striking. Was that a finding surprising to you, or was it in line with what you would have thought from the funding discrepancies?
Yeah, it wasn't surprising. It was probably what we expected, but it was a bigger. I was not sure, like I say, given the size of our sample, whether we would really see that pronounced of a difference. But there's clearly a big difference there. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the fairly low, I think it's, like you said, 45% of respondents that reported participating in a grant review, but it's much more like 80 or 90% that actually were interested. So there's clearly a lot of interest there. They're just not participating. So then when we asked specifically why, what are some of the barriers? The number one barrier that our respondents came back with is not being invited. So that's pretty telling, I think. That simply the invitations have not been extended to a lot of scientists from minority serving institutions, which is why they're participating less. But if you look at motivations, scientists from minority serving institutions are very highly motivated, and in fact they have some different motivations from scientists that responded to our survey from traditionally white institutes. And specifically, I mean that there was a high motivation to give back to the community, just like scientists from our previous survey, but there were also quite a lot of interest in terms of improving networks and career advancements and improving grantsmanship. Those were all motivations that were much higher in this sample compared to our previous one. And that makes sense. If grant funding is that much tighter at minority serving institutions, then it makes sense that this career focus would be important. So those are some of the big differences.
Okay, so that uncovers, a pretty big discrepancy of, that 45% versus 76% participation in grant reviews. I'm wondering, did you see any differences, in that number across, the different types of minority serving institutions?
Yeah, no, actually, that's surprising. We didn't find any differences in levels of participation across the different types of minority serving institutions. So there were no statistical differences between HBCUs and HSIs, for instance. But that also could be the size of our sample. There might be some power issues there. So it would be very interesting to have a much larger survey that had a much bigger sample to play with.
Okay, so moving back to that sort of headline discrepancy, and the fact in particular that, the reason people cited for not participating in grant review was not being invited, what would you attribute that to? Is that a function of, informal networks, not including these people? Are we looking at bias? Do you really have an idea of, kind of what might underlie, that discrepancy in invitation?
Right. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that we asked about potential barriers to participation. And there were a lot of, we also, in addition to asking people very specific questions with like kind of forced choice answers, like yes or no, or a multiple choice response, we also had open text as part of this survey. And so we were able to gather a lot of quotes. So just to kind of give you a sense of what some of the respondents thought, I mean, one respondent mentioned, it seems like you have to be a member of some club to get invited to participate. Although I'm a successful PI on several well-funded government and foundation grants over my 34 years, I was invited only once to serve on an external grant review panel. So I think that's fairly telling about invitation. I think simply just not being invited is an important one. But there were other reasons as well that respondents gave. As you mentioned, kind of there's a perceived or perception of a lack of networking or a knowledge of the general funding system that prevented these scientists from at least perceiving that they've been seen by research funders. I know someone I think said, I'm not even sure how to go about getting on a review panel. So those are some important reasons. I think another one that's I think probably specific to minority serving institutions to a degree is lack of time. Granted, everyone is pressed for time everywhere, and scientists are busy everywhere. But several studies previously about grant submission have also focused on this lack of time, and a lot of the comments that have come up from our survey and from other surveys in the literature, like I say, about grant submission, specifically talk about high teaching loads, administrative and service duties that are kind of rolled into a part of being a faculty member at an MSI. And so those are things that can contribute to the time barrier.
And what kind of feeds that, extra workload, that extra teaching load? Is that a function itself of the, discrepancies in funding that we also see in other places?
I think there's a bit of like I say, a feedback loop, in the sense that, if a requirement for participating in a peer review panel is, for instance, getting grant funding, and your institution is not getting very high levels of grant funding, then it's likely if you don't get funded, then you're not going to be a reviewer. And if you're not going to be a reviewer, you may not get exposed to the grant review process and have an opportunity to increase your network, to improve your grantsmanship skills, and therefore the cycle kind of continues. So I think there is a bit of a loop there, but there's also probably a lot of potential opportunities for intervention. Is that right?
I think I would add, just personally being a product of an HBCU, a lot of HBCUs, as you were alluding to, James, really put kind of high stakes on teaching, engagement, and training of the students. And therefore, you have a lot of HBCUs that are specifically HBCUs that are putting out STEM-related bachelor's level people that actually are liberal arts colleges, right? So they don't have the great environment and infrastructure that a traditionally white institution that might have a liberal arts component, but also has kind of an academic research or medical center attached to it. A lot of the HBCUs that are putting out these STEM professionals, maybe they don't have those environments that they are connected to that some of the other TWIs have as well. And so now you have to think about the professors are now at this institution that puts this high level of importance on training and mentorship and teaching. And so the professors also don't have the infrastructure or the environment. And it goes back into the feedback loop that I think Steve was trying to mention. So you have these professors at these liberal arts colleges that might have a desire to come out and do research, but they don't have the environment, they don't have the resources, the professors have to go and make these collaborations and networks and come up with a way to engage and get money and be able to do research and find the way to do that. And a lot of that comes in with being on a peer review panel, right? So you get to see what other people are doing. You get to make networks and collaborations that could ultimately give a professor at a small HBCU liberal arts focused college a connection with a counterpart that might be 5 miles away with the research infrastructure that the students and the professor could take advantage of. So I do think it's a feedback loop that a lot of the professors that are focused on training and teaching and kind of the hallmarks of what like a lot of the historically Black colleges and universities look at, how they dig themselves a space to be able to move out and do those other things. But I think I would be remiss to say, like, I don't want all the HBCU people to come and find me. There are a lot of historically Black colleges and universities that are doing an amazing job of building their research infrastructure. And so I think the Morehouse School of Medicine and the Howards and the Florida A&Ms and, you know, the North Carolina A&Ts, like a lot of the larger universities that are building out that infrastructure, they still need to get money for funding. And they still have to set themselves apart as a place that's doing solid research in addition to training and teaching and mentoring those students. So I think that there's a lot that happens there.
And if I could add too, you know, I think, again, the results of the survey show that while people are not participating as high in as high levels as scientists from traditionally white institutes, they are very interested. There's high levels of interest. And you could say, well, maybe they're not submitting grants at the same rate. But in fact, we've found almost very similar levels of our respondents submitting grants at some similar levels to our previous survey. So this sample population compared to our other population is very similar in terms of grant submission, at least in terms of the number of grants that they submit, but they're not getting invited to peer review panels. So it's not that people are not trying; they are, but they're not being invited. So that's, I think, one important point.
Okay, so one thing I've noticed, you know, throughout this conversation and in reading the article, which I of course encourage everyone to read, is that we frequently talk about feedback loops, and I would draw everyone's attention. You know, I think the article is free to view. Go ahead and, you know, I hope our listeners will open up Figure 5 right now, because it's sort of a, you know, an illustration of you know, that feedback loop, the deleterious one in which you know, you know, the seats at the table kind of get closed off, and there's not a lot of room to you know, to get in. But I'm wondering then about, you know, what kind of interventions, you know, could be performed since we, you know, recognize the problem. We, you know, understand that you know, the funding discrepancies are relevant and a big problem. How do we work toward ameliorating that? How do we, you know, increase participation in, you know, grant review from researchers at minority serving institutions?
I mean, I would say there's a couple kind of key areas that should be focused on, but the first one is probably the simplest, which is that there just needs to be more outreach from funding agencies to recruit scientists from minority serving institutions to participate in peer review. I think that's and that should be something where maybe they should you know, consider a more inclusive eligibility to review grants, and as well as just being more proactive in the inclusivity of the recruitment. So I think that's certainly a big starting point. But another point of intervention, research funders can work with minority serving institutions to kind of relax policies and practices that are restrictive for MSIs with fewer resources, helping to kind of incentivize involvement in grant submission. Several people have mentioned in the survey that you know, there's a culture that's not necessarily set up to support grant submission, which just adds an extra barrier to trying to participate. And then finally, I think networks just in general are very important. Improving access to collaborative networks, to publishing networks, to funding networks, and that requires outreach on a variety of different levels, at an institutional and agency level and also an individual level.
Okay, so it sounds like there are some interventions that could be performed at various points in those feedback loops to potentially improve things. I'm wondering now, what are you looking at next for your research in the space? What are the unanswered questions that kind of might be interesting to think about, in the future, in looking toward kind of ameliorating some of these troubles?
I think, one thing certainly is to kind of examine some of these networks and to look at maybe in a proactive way how to improve some of them and to kind of measure the changes that we see along the way. I think examining the power of these networks to shape a more equitable landscape in research would be interesting, because there's a lot of evidence that improvements in diversity often lead to innovation, which benefits everyone. So
I guess I could add, just because Steve and I have lots and lots of conversations about how we can look at kind of the diversity initiatives at AIBS and allow some of the research that we do to uncover some equity issues. So we've often talked about whether we should investigate the participation rate or barriers to participation in peer review, the difference in underrepresented minorities at traditional white institutions versus underrepresented minorities in minority serving institutions. Is there a difference there? Because as we noticed in this exact research project that we did, we really tried to dig deep into just faculty members at minority serving institutions. But as we mentioned earlier, there's a great subset of African American scientists that were trained at minority institutions, specifically at HBCUs, that are now out in the majority world doing science. And is there a difference there? Are there barriers there? Because the diversity still isn't there, regardless of whether they're from traditional white institutions or from minority serving institutions. So I do think that's an area that we really could dig a little deeper into. And then, we've had so many conversations that really go outside of peer review, but I do think another thing that we've thought about or talked about is kind of considering the metrics for kind of promotion and tenure at minority serving institutions versus at traditional white institutions, and how that could play a role in the diversity of the panels. Because how do minority serving institutions actually promote their research assistant professors to assistant professors to full professorship? What are those metrics? Are they teaching and mentoring, or is it research funding? So are we able to look at those kind of barriers as well? Because as scientific administrators, often the scientific administrators are looking to invite scientists to these panels that have professorships or associate professorships. And so is there a difference in the way that minority serving institutions are promoting their professors versus the way that traditional white institutions are promoting their professors? And does that play a role in how scientific administrators are looking to invite people to sit on panels as well, just based on what their promotional title is? So I think we have lots of ways in which we can continue to dig deeper into barriers for peer review and the metrics that associate with diversity of peer review panels as well. So we could talk about that forever, but I think those are two additional things that Steve and I have talked about that I do think is very interesting for AIBS to look into.
That's great, and we'll certainly look forward to hearing more. And hopefully, some more in the pages of Bioscience too. I should mention that this was, kind of particularly fun because I'm getting to talk to people who I talk to from time to time because we all work for AIBS, and it's been great fun to have the article in Bioscience as well. So thank you all very, very much for joining me today. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, James. It was great.
Thank you, James.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.